So I want to take these two comparisons and apply some very simple lessons to our task of presenting the gospel to the entire world, to every nation, to every creature, to the ends of the earth. And I want to extract 5 simple lessons or principles. First of all, if you read the account of the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew's Gospel as we read it, it's very clear that the disciples did not want the responsibility of feeding 5,000 people. They said, it's getting late, send them away now so that they still have time to get somewhere where they can buy food before it gets dark. They had enough sense to see this is going to be a major problem, let's avoid it. I think the attitude of the church is commonly the same. You read it. He said, you give them to eat. And I believe exactly the same. We may want to escape the responsibility of presenting the gospel to the whole world, but Jesus says, your job. It is your responsibility. I have ordered you to do it. And I have never retracted the order. Secondly, I'd like to illustrate from the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 a relationship what I think is very important between two things which tend to be regarded by some Christians as almost opposites. Let me say in general, Christians are very simplistic in their approach. They say two things which are different and they kind of feel, well, we've got to make a choice for one. Like, for instance, between the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit. They are not alternatives. God doesn't say, I'm so impoverished that if I give you gifts, I can't afford to let you have fruit. God says, I expect you to have fruit and exercise it through the gifts. The gifts are the means to make fruit available. They're not contrary. They complement one another. Now, in this situation, I see, again, two things which are often regarded as being inconsistent. And yet they're not. The one is what I would call order or discipline. The other is God's supernatural power. And we tend to have in the church groups that will major on one or the other. There's the order, discipline group. Everybody lined up. Everybody with their own shepherd. Everybody accountable. Everybody doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, everybody allotted, everybody in a place. Now, that's not wrong. In fact, it's very clearly demonstrated in the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus said, make them sit down in groups of 50s, in rows. If he hadn't done that, some of the people would never have got fed. Because the people at the front would have helped themselves and the people at the back would never have made it. That being human nature, when people are hungry, believe me, if you've seen hungry people, they lose their manners very quickly. There would have probably been some people that would have been trampled underfoot and actually lost their lives in the rush of the multitude to receive this food. So it was imperative that they begin with order, with getting everybody into a sizable group that could be dealt with. To me, that's a very clear example of the importance of order, of authority, of discipleship. But, let me point out, they could have got everybody neatly ordered in groups of 50 and left them hungry. What good would have that been? That was not sufficient. It was necessary, but not sufficient. To make it effective, then the supernatural grace and power of God had to be released. Supernatural power in the service of the Lord is not an option. It's not something that you can have, well, he's the kind of person that goes after that kind of thing. I'm not much interested in that. I just want to lead a quiet, decent, orderly Christian life. Miracles and gifts of the Spirit, that's fine, but I'm not that kind of person. I don't believe that any of us has a right to take that attitude. I believe it's an unscriptural attitude. As Bob Mumford has said, the gifts of the Spirit are not toys. They're tools. They have to be there to get the job done. And so I want to suggest to you that the second principle here is that the order and discipline has to be balanced and complemented by the supernatural power of God to work a miracle. And I'm not just really thinking in terms of miracles of healing. I'm talking about a miraculous way of looking at things, a miraculous approach to life, an approach that never says I'm limited to my own ability and my own resources, but views every situation in the light of God's unlimited resources. That's what I mean by a supernatural approach to life. The third principle is that the multiplication did not depend merely on Jesus, but it depended on the disciples passing on what they received from Jesus. If the disciples had not passed on what they received, the miracle would never have been consummated. And I believe, again, the same is true with you and me, with the grace of God. It is not dependent only on Jesus. It originates with Jesus, but it has to be completed by our cooperation and activity. I believe the same is true in the task of reaching the entire world. The grace originates with Jesus. The power originates with Jesus. The provision originates with Jesus. But for the world to receive it, we have to receive it and pass it on. We can either become channels or barriers. And I'm inclined to think that's the only option that we have. There isn't a third alternative. When God gives an order and makes His grace available, we have just two options. You can become a channel of it or a barrier to it. And I would like to suggest to everybody here this morning, that's where you are. Right now, you're either a channel or a barrier. And if you're not a channel, you are a barrier. There are no gray areas. You either go on in faith or you go back into unbelief. There's not a third choice. You know, I see many Christians today backsliding, not because they wanted to sin, but because they were afraid to go forward in faith. I see that as perhaps the greatest danger that confronts us as Christians, is being afraid to move on in faith. We want to play it safe. We want to be secure. We don't want to take the risk. We'll just sit where we are and keep things nice. I don't believe that's an option. I don't believe we can do that. I believe we either go forward into more faith or we go back into unbelief. And unbelief, the writer of Hebrews says, leads to perdition. And concerning the people that do that, God says, my soul has no pleasure in them. The options are not complicated. They're very clear. The fourth principle I see in this miracle is that multiplication continued until all the needs were met and beyond. Not merely was everybody fed, but everybody was fed and they had a lot more left over at the end than they began with. Now that's no accident. I believe Jesus is demonstrating God's resources are limitless. He's never limited to just meeting the need. He always has abundance. One of the key words in understanding God is the word abundance. I don't know any one word that better describes God than the word abundant. God has always got more than enough. And as I understand Scripture, He's always willing to make available to us more than enough. 2 Corinthians 9:8, God is able to make all grace abound toward us, that we always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. Sufficiency is having enough. Abundance is having more than enough. But the abundance is given us, not for selfish pleasure and indulgence, but for every good work. And then, the final point that I want to extract from these miracles is this: the greater the need and the fewer the resources, the greater the surplus. I want to say that again. It's really almost comical. The greater the need and the fewer the resources, the greater the surplus. And let me now go back and give you the figures. The first miracle, there were 5,000 men. The second, there were only 4,000. The first miracle, they had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The second miracle, they had 7 loaves and a few fishes. So in the first miracle, the number of people to be fed was larger. The resources with which they started were smaller. And then Jesus was very specific that they remembered what was left over. In fact, it's interesting, if you read all 4 Gospels, you found out it was his idea to pick up the fragments. He's always been a member of the Anti-Litter League. And the disciples, I think, would have walked away and left the place littered. Jesus said, go and pick the fragments up. And just see how many you've got. All right, so in the first miracle, they had 12 large baskets. The second miracle, they had 7 picnic baskets. And it's difficult to be absolutely sure, but I've looked these words up in the most reliable Greek dictionaries. And it appears that the baskets in the first miracle were larger than the baskets in the second. So at the end of the first miracle, they gathered up 12 larger baskets. At the end of the second, they gathered up 7 smaller baskets. And Jesus said, remember all the figures. Remember how many were fed. Remember what you started with. Remember what you ended with. Why was he so insistent? I am sure he was emphasizing this principle, and I'm going to say it once again. The greater the need and the fewer the resources, the greater the surplus. God will always make sure that we realize there's no shortage with him. The bigger the challenge, the less we have to start with, the more we can expect God's abundance, not the less. That's where we have to change our thinking. And really, every one of us is a slave of our thinking. We don't move beyond the way we envisage things. And believing the Bible means a revolution in your way of thinking, for all of us. I was confronted at the end of last year and the beginning of this with a decision about the future course of my own ministry. I received a proposal, a very intelligent and sensible one, as to how I could extend and increase my ministry. And it was really I think it was a God-ordained challenge. But as I meditated on the proposal, I saw that I would be going against certain basic principles that God had taught me individually over the years. And so I eventually decided, Lord, I'm going to trust you for the increase. I'm not going to use perfectly legitimate, but somewhat carnal methods. If you don't do it, I'm really not too interested in it happening. And I appreciate, as it were, being confronted with this decision at this point. And since I made that decision, I've felt a release in my own spirit. Now, I don't need to go into details, but the suggested way of doing it was perfectly legitimate and is followed by many ministries in this country. But when I considered it for myself, I saw that isn't the way the Lord has led me. I'd rather reach out. I'd rather spend less time building my own base and catering to my own financial needs, and more time reaching out to people who aren't reached and for whom most of the church doesn't care at all, than securing my financial base. No, that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in financial security. What it really means is if I have a larger crowd and smaller resources, I expect a greater surplus. That's That's the way I see it. All right. Now I want to apply the truths that I've been seeking to unfold as quickly as I can. I want to say again what I've said once already. In the light of what I've presented to you from the New Testament, I believe we have only two options. It could be that some of you will be wishing you hadn't come this morning. I don't know. I hope not. Because I think you're going to walk out of here confronted with something that you cannot evade. We have only two options: to obey or to disobey. Now, this is true of the whole church, in every nation, every land. The whole church shares this responsibility to present the gospel in every other land and nation, wherever it hasn't been presented. But I believe there's a certain principle which Jesus unfolds in the New Testament, which makes our responsibility as Christians in the United States greater than almost that of any other group of Christians. And this principle is stated in Luke chapter 12 and verse 48, the latter part of the verse. For everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And to whom much has been committed, of him they will ask the more. So Jesus is saying, the more that you have committed to you, the more you have available to you, very logically, proportionately, God will require more from you. Now, I believe that in many ways, as American Christians, we have more committed to us, possibly than any other group of Christians anywhere in the world. Financially, the United States is one of the wealthy, powerful nations. There are other nations today which have possibly a higher standard of living. Switzerland is one, Norway is another. But there are very few. And even those who are what we would call here below the poverty level in the United States, and there are probably not many such here this morning, even those, compared with the world at large, are relatively wealthy. I wish I could communicate this to you, because I think most American Christians have very little concept how the rest of the world lives, how the third world lives, how Asia lives, how Africa lives, how South America lives. And I'm not saying there isn't genuine poverty in the United States, but most of us are used to being able to choose what we'll eat. I would say more than half the world has no choice, and over 10 million people are probably going to die of starvation this year. Most of us contemplate having sheets in our beds. Most of the world has never seen a sheet, wouldn't know what to do with it. All of us expect to wear shoes on our feet. I question whether half the world wears shoes on its feet. I wonder if you know what it's like never to have worn a pair of shoes. Even in Kenya, when I was there, and now Kenya is a relatively well-to-do third world country, I can remember the delight my students experienced when for the first time they put on a pair of shoes. It says in the Song of Solomon, how beautiful are thy feet with shoes, O prince's daughter. And I heard somebody say once, do you really feel like a prince's daughter when you get shoes on your feet? You couldn't understand that, because you've never been faced with a situation, most of you, where you didn't have shoes. There are some possibly of the more advanced generation who possibly took off their shoes to walk to school. I don't know. I've known people that couldn't afford to wear out their shoes, but in school they had to wear shoes. So they would carry their shoes to school and then put them on when they got to school. But there are not many of you that have had that experience. See, what we consider poor, majority of the world would consider wealthy. There isn't probably anybody here this morning that is poor by world standards. You may be not wealthy by American standards, but that's not a real valid comparison for the world at large. And that's not merely that, but the liberty that we enjoy as American Christians to practice our religion with protection and with special favors and provisions from the government is, I would imagine, unique. I question whether there's any other country in the world where Christians have the same privileges. For instance, tax exemption for churches. I believe they have it in Canada. I doubt whether there's another nation on earth where they even think of it. Most other nations today, even nominally Christian nations, they would try to get it out of the church, not to make it available to the church. Christians in Britain are staggered by the thought that you can make contributions to a church and have them taken out of your income. They've never had that privilege. Christians in Germany automatically have a deduction from their income to pay for the state church, whether they want it or not. I'm saying we have unique privileges, unique opportunities, unrivaled anywhere else on earth. Consider one other unique privilege of English-speaking Christians, whatever their color or race. We have teaching material available in English on a scale that is not available in any other language to any other nation. If you're talking about practical Bible teaching that tells you how to apply the Bible in your life and what it really means, not abstract, remote, long-worded theology, my guess would be, and it's simply a guess, that 90% of all such material is in English. Even civilized nations, intellectual education nations like Germany, it's very hard to find any kind of literature of that sort in the German language. In French, it's almost non-existent. Perhaps Sweden would be the country that comes nearest, but it's far, far behind the English-speaking countries, to whom much is given. Of him shall much also be required. We are uniquely privileged. I think I can say that more because I'm an American citizen by naturalization. I was educated and brought up in Britain. Britain is a privileged nation, but Christians in Britain are not half as privileged as Christians in the United States. What does that mean? It means that we have more than our numerical share of the responsibility for communicating the gospel to all nations. Much has been given to us, thank God for it. But much will be required from us. Now, in closing this message, I want to give what I would call relevant warnings, because it's my intention that this message be extremely practical. I do not want just to stir your emotions. If that was all I could achieve, I wouldn't try. Because if your emotions merely are stirred and your will is not affected, you'll be under greater condemnation from now on than you were before, and that's not my intention. So let me offer you just a few relevant warnings. First, if any change is needed in any of us, and I'm leaving you to determine whether your life is fully lined up with the orders that Jesus has given. But if any change is required, primarily it should be a change of attitude, not action. Don't do as Lewis Carroll wrote about a certain man. Run out of the hotel, mount on your horse, ride rapidly in all four directions at once. Because you won't get anywhere that way. All right. I'm not suggesting that in the next 30 minutes you've got to do something totally different from what you've been doing. What I do believe is that most of us need a change of attitude. That's primary. If I can achieve that this morning, I will be very, very satisfied. Second principle is that it's obvious we should not and could not all, quote, go. In fact, that would be chaotic if we did. That would defeat its own purposes. As to who should actually go and who should not, that's something the Holy Spirit has to indicate to us individually and collectively. What I'm giving you is general direction, which comes from Scripture. Particular direction comes from the Holy Spirit individually. But even if you do not go, you should see yourself just as totally involved as those who do go. I would like you to think this way. Whoever has gone or will go, you should view as your brother, your sister, your child. Exactly that way. I'm talking about a natural relation. They should be as close to you and important to you as the closest members of your family. Everything that happens to them, good or bad, should be of concern to you if you have the right attitude. Third, each individual and each fellowship must discern their God-given sphere. Each of us has a God-given sphere as individuals and, I believe, fellowships. And so, in applying this teaching, we have to hear from God as to what is my individual sphere and our collective sphere. Let me give you just two quick examples of this principle, very quickly from the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 2, verses 7 through 9, this speaks about a confrontation between Paul and his co-workers and Peter and James and John and their co-workers. But on the contrary, when they, that is Peter, James, and John, saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcision was to Peter, and then going on to verse 9, when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So there was a very clear demarcation of spheres of responsibility. And notice, interestingly enough, in those days, the primary and the most important sphere of influence was not all the millions of Gentiles, but the little handful of Jews. They were first on the list. See how far we have come in our thinking and attitudes today from that of the New Testament church. And I'm not saying what's right or wrong, I'm just pointing out that it wasn't measured by numbers. And I don't believe it is today. At any rate, the principle is there. Peter, James, and John, their sphere was the Jewish people, the circumcised. Paul and his co-workers, their sphere was the uncircumcised, the Gentile world. They saw clearly and acknowledged that each group had their God-given sphere. And then in 2 Corinthians 10:14, just one verse, and it may not come out the same in all translations, but the principle is the same. 2 Corinthians 10:14. Paul says, "For we are not extending ourselves beyond our sphere, thus not reaching to you. For it was to you that we first came with the gospel of Christ." And it's a complicated sentence in Greek. There are different ways of translating it. But if you look at them, they all boil down to the same thing, that Paul and his co-workers had a specific sphere of responsibility in the total world that they had to be answerable for. And so when we consider the task of bringing the gospel to the whole world, we have to acknowledge it's our task. It's not somebody else's task. Collectively, it's our task. But within the total task, God allots to each individual, and I believe to each group that is organically joined in Him, spheres of responsibility. And to this particular congregation, I would say that your primary sphere, our primary sphere of responsibility, is the same as Peter, James, and John. It's the circumcised. God has demonstrated that. It's happened. Or maybe nobody planned it. But this particular congregation has had a greater impact on the Jewish people in this total area than all the other churches put together, I would guess. It's not something we need to boast about. But it's to see, it's through being in our sphere. However, I do not believe that the sphere of this church is limited only to the Jewish people. I believe that's number one. And I believe, if I may say so, it's really a special mark of God's favor that He's allotted that sphere to us. I hope I won't offend anybody, but I think I have learned over the years a little bit of God's level of thinking. Lydia, my first wife, was called specifically to the Jewish people and to Palestine. And privately she would say to me, if you observe the people who are called to the Jews, they're different from the ones who are called to the Gentiles. They're usually older and they're usually more mature. God used to send young people to Africa, to China. And they didn't have, in a way, to have a lot of worldly wisdom. You send the same people to the Jewish people, they'll bounce off them like a rubber ball off a concrete wall. It's different. All right, but the principle that I'm making is you've got to find your sphere. You can cause more harm than good if you rush around in somebody else's sphere. But if you don't carry out your responsibility in your own sphere, you're going to have to answer to God. And the final principle I want to make quickly is even when others go to a different sphere than ours, we should still see them as our representatives and our responsibility. Nothing grieves me more than the small-mindedness of most Christians. For instance, let me give you an example. I believe that the gospel needs to be presented to every tribe, nation, language, and people. Because there's got to be at least one representative from every one of them in the redeemed. If you read 5th chapter of Revelation, every single tribe and nation and tongue has got to be represented in the redeemed. The church will not be complete until they are. So I have a tremendous concern for the work of the Wycliffe translators. Every time I hear about one of them, my heart leaps. Because it's a difficult, unromantic, unrewarding, tough assignment. Only people of real commitment and dedication will ever undertake it. Now, I don't believe I'm called in any way to do that kind of work. What I'm saying is, I don't feel they are Wycliffe translators, they're nothing to do with me. I feel they're my representatives. They're doing what I'm not able to do, what I'm not called to do. But God, every time they succeed, I'll bless you for it. I'll pray for them when it's laid on my heart to pray for them. I'll offer for them if God prompts me. I'm proud of them. I want you to understand, they're not on our team, but they're playing in the same league. And oh, what you miss through being small-minded, if you are small-minded. All right, just make one more remark. As you know, I travel a lot, meet a lot of different people, and enjoy it. It's one of the great privileges and blessings. I'm not restricted to one view of Christianity, to one type of Christian, to one type of Christian group. I meet them all, and I love them all. And some of the strangest I love the best. Well, we'll go no further with that. I wanted you to know I love you people. But I meet some people who are what I would call high on Christianity. Some of you don't know what it is to be high. Some of you do. There's something exhilarating about meeting Christians who are high on Christianity, you know. I mean, I never could have too many of them. They might embarrass you a little, but I still praise God for them. And I'll tell you the two distinctive features of such people that, as I've noticed, number one, they believe it's their responsibility to reach the whole world and every nation with the gospel. And they take it seriously. And number two, they believe Jesus is coming soon. And I want to be high that way. I don't think I'm ever going to be too high on those two convictions.